Tonight, let me tell you about the loneliest queen in history, a woman who wasn't executed for being evil. She was executed for being frivolous at the exact wrong moment in time. This is the story of Marie Antoinette. History remembers the guillotine, the theatrical spectacle of her death. But that's just punctuation. The real story is the sentence that came before it. She was the military genius who... No, wait. She wasn't. She was the strategic mind who... Nope. She was a 14-year-old girl sold like expensive livestock to seal an alliance, who spent the next 23 years playing dress-up while France starved. Her crime wasn't cruelty. It was spectacular, tragic disconnection from reality. When the real world came knocking with politics, starvation, and revolution, she did what any terrified, ill-equipped child would do: locked the door, turned up the music, and built a fantasy world right as the real one began to burn. If you appreciate history with the propaganda peeled off and the ugly truth exposed, consider subscribing and dropping a comment with where you're listening from. Curious who else enjoys their history served black, without the sugar coating of myth. The story you've heard. The arrogant queen who said let them eat cake, who deserved her fate. The truth is more complicated and infinitely sadder. She was a child playing dress-up in a world that demanded a monarch. A teenager spending a fortune she didn't understand in a country she couldn't see. A mother building a fantasy to protect her children, and in doing so, sealing all their fates. Now take a slow, deep breath. Settle into your cozier spot. Let the world outside fade away, as we journey back to October 1793, to a cell in the conciergerie prison, where a woman with white hair sits mending a black mourning dress, trying to remember who she'd been before the cage closed around her. The cage was called Versailles. She was 14 when they locked her inside, May 1770, the island of the Rhine, exactly halfway between Austria and France. A pavilion had been built for a ceremony, not a celebration, but a transaction. Inside, the air hung thick with competing perfumes attempting to mask the smell of river mud and diplomatic sweat. Two nations that had spent a century killing each other were about to trade a child to seal their newest, most fragile peace. They called her the Archduchess Maria Antonia Josepha Johanna. She was a Habsburg, daughter of the Holy Roman Empress Maria Theresa, raised in Vienna's gilded corridors where the morning light filtered through stained glass, and portraits of ancestors watched with painted disapproval. She spoke German, loved music, laughed too loudly for court propriety, and had absolutely no idea what was about to happen to her. The ceremony was systematic, brutal in its precision. She entered the pavilion from the Austrian side, still Maria Antonia, still wearing her Austrian clothes, still accompanied by her Austrian attendants. In the centre of the pavilion they stripped her, not violently, but thoroughly. Every piece of Austrian fabric removed, every familiar face dismissed. Her childhood dress, embroidered with the double-headed eagle of the Habsburgs, folded and carried away. The small wooden rosary her mother had given her, confiscated. Even her little dog, a terrier named Mops who had slept at the foot of her bed since she was 8, carried back across the border by weeping servants. They dressed her in French silk that felt wrong against her skin. French ladies in waiting, their faces polite masks hiding assessment, adjusted the unfamiliar stays and smoothed the foreign fabric. They braided her auburn hair in the French style, pinning it with French jewels. Someone handed her a French prayer book she couldn't yet read fluently. She walked out the other side of the pavilion as Marie Antoinette, Dauphine of France, property of a country she'd never seen, bride to a boy she'd never met, future queen of a nation that would learn to hate her with revolutionary fervour. But she didn't know that yet. So she smiled. Because 14-year-old girls smile when adults tell them to, and stepped into the French carriage that would carry her toward Versailles. The journey took days, through each town. Crowds gathered, curious mostly. Some cheered, a few threw flowers. She waved from the carriage window, performing the role she'd been taught, while inside her chest something fundamental shifted and settled into a new, uncomfortable configuration. She was learning the first lesson of her new life. You're not a person anymore. You're a symbol. Act accordingly. Versailles, when she finally arrived, was not a palace. It was a trap disguised as paradise. The place sprawled across manicured grounds like a beautiful disease. Gardens stretched to the horizon, each hedge precisely trimmed, each fountain performing its choreographed dance. The palace itself gleamed with gilt and marble, its hall of mirrors reflecting infinity back at anyone foolish enough to search for themselves in its depths. 10,000 people lived there, courtiers, servants, hangers-on, predators in silk who smiled with their mouths while their eyes calculated your weakness. The air inside smelled of too many bodies in too fine clothes. Perfume, heavy, cloying, desperate, attempting to mask the fact that bathing was infrequent and toilets were buckets and corners. Sweat and powder and beeswax and ambition, all mixed into an atmosphere thick enough to choke on. They led her through corridors where painted ceilings depicted gods who looked suspiciously like previous kings, past galleries where ancestors in gilt frames seemed to whisper warnings she couldn't quite hear. Every step echoed, every eye followed. She was 14 years old and she had never been so alone in a room full of people. Her husband, the boy who would be Louis XVI, was 15, awkward, shy, more interested in hunting and locksmithing than in the political alliance that required their coupling. Their wedding night was a disaster of mutual terror and confusion. So was the next night, and the next, 7 years. Their marriage went unconsummated for 7 years. History would mock them both for it. But the truth was simpler and sadder than the satirical cartoon suggested. He was a boy who loved clocks more than people, terrified of the act, possibly suffering from a condition that made it painful. She was a girl playing dress-up as a woman, with no one to explain what was expected and no escape from the mounting pressure. Her only job was to produce an heir. It was literally why she existed at Versailles, a womb on loan from Austria, valuable only for its potential yield. And she was failing, the court whispered. Then it laughed. Then it turned vicious. The Austrian witch, the barren queen, the expensive decoration that couldn't perform its singular function. The pamphlet started crude, cruel, speculating about her body, her habits, her supposed depravities. She was 17 years old and France was publishing pornographic cartoons about her inability to get pregnant. She had two choices: face the terrifying, lonely reality of her failure and irrelevance, or escape into something else, anything else, somewhere the whispers couldn't reach, where she could pretend to be anyone other than the disappointing Dauphine who couldn't manage the one thing she'd been imported to accomplish. Marie Antoinette chose escape. She chose parties that lasted until dawn, gambling that scattered fortunes across Green Bay's tables like seeds that would never grow. She chose towering hairstyles that became architectural projects, wigs 3 feet high, decorated with feathers and flowers, and once, memorably, a model ship in full sail, armour fashioned from flour and wire and denial. She chose a small circle of friends, the Polignac family mostly, who let her pretend she was just Antonia again, just a girl, not the symbol everyone else needed her to be. She showered them with gifts, titles, money, royal appointments, buying their affection because purchased love was better than the alternative of none at all. The court hated her for it. The people, when they heard, would hate her more, because while she played at being a normal girl with an unlimited budget, France was quietly, steadily going bankrupt. While she lost thousands at cards each night, peasants were counting copper coins and calculating how to feed their children through winter. She wasn't cruel. She just didn't think, didn't see. Why would she? The real France, the one beyond Versailles gates, was loud and smelled bad and demanded things she didn't know how to give. Her fantasy was prettier, quieter, more comfortable. The gilded cage had always been a prison. She just didn't know it yet. So she decorated her cell, turned up the music, and pretended she was anywhere else but trapped. The tragedy wasn't that she was evil. It was that she was shallow. And in the end, France wouldn't forgive her for it. Since the real world had rejected her, Marie decided to buy a new one. The king had his hobbies, his beloved clocks that he could take apart and understand, his hunting where the rules were clear and the prey predictable. Marie found her own escape routes, and they were paved with gold coins that flowed from the French treasury like water from a broken fountain. This is where the myth of the frivolous queen was born, and the terrible truth is, it's accurate. The nights became her real life. That's when Versailles transformed from a prison into a playground, when the oppressive formality of day gave way to something wilder, more desperate, more honest in its dishonesty. The sound of her evenings, dice clattering across felt-covered tables, the whisper slide of playing cards dealt in endless succession, champagne corks popping at 3 a.m. like small, celebratory explosions. She gambled constantly, endless hands where fortunes changed with the turn of a card. Some nights she won, most nights she lost. It didn't matter. The money wasn't real to her, just abstract numbers, infinite resources, someone else's problem. Historians would later calculate her gambling debts at hundreds of thousands of livres. To put that in perspective, a skilled craftsman in Paris earned perhaps 500 livres a year. She could lose his lifetime earnings in a single evening and simply wave for more wine. The hair became legendary. The infamous poof style, wigs constructed like architectural projects, towers of human hair, horsehair, wool, and wire, all cemented together with pomade and powder. They grew taller each season, as if height could elevate her above criticism. 3 feet high, sometimes more, decorated with ribbons, jewels, feathers, flowers, and once, memorably, absurdly, a model ship in full sail commemorating a French naval victory she couldn't have located on a map. Her head ached constantly from the weight. The pomade attracted lice. The powder made her sneeze. But the wigs were armour, making her literally too tall to ignore, transforming her into a walking spectacle that was definitely Marie Antoinette. Definitely not the frightened Austrian girl who still dreamed in German. She built a world within Versailles' world. The Polignac family became her chosen family. Yolande de Polignac, particularly, became the friend, the confidant, the mother figure she had left behind in Vienna. Marie showered them with everything: money, titles, royal appointments they weren't qualified for. The Polignacs went from minor nobility to major power, growing fat on royal favour while the kingdom grew thin. The court seethed with resentment. Here were these nobodies, elevated by nothing more than the Queen's affection, while ancient families who'd served France for centuries couldn't get an audience. The pamphlets grew crueler, the Austrian whore and her favourites, speculation about exactly what services the Polignacs provided to earn such generosity. But with her small circle, Marie could pretend, could be Antonia again, just a girl with friends, laughing at private jokes, playing cards, gossiping about people who weren't there to defend themselves. It was a tiny island of informal affection in an ocean of formal hatred. The tragedy is that she wasn't evil. She was just profoundly, catastrophically young, a teenager with unlimited credit in a country sliding toward bankruptcy. She didn't understand budgets or economics, or the growing desperation beyond Versailles' gates. Why would she? That world was ugly and smelled bad and reminded her of everything she was failing at. Her world was prettier, more comfortable, more kind. France was her kingdom, but Versailles was her country, and she never left it if she could help it. The real France. The villages where peasants boiled grass to feed their children. The cities where bread prices sparked riots. The provinces where ancient feudal obligations were crushing people into dust. It was just noise, rumours, someone else's responsibility. Her husband, elevated now to Louis XVI after his grandfather's death, was no help. He remained distant, awkward, more interested in his locksmith's tools than his kingdom. 7 years of unconsummated marriage finally ended, some say after a minor medical procedure. Others credit the intervention of Marie's brother, who visited and apparently gave some very specific advice. The details are lost to history, replaced by jokes and speculation, but once the marriage was finally consummated, the children came. First a daughter, Marie-Thérèse, in 1778, then a son, the Dauphin Louis-Joseph, in 1781, then another son, Louis-Charles, in 1785, another daughter, Sophie, who lived only 11 months. Mother had changed something in Marie. Not enough, not fast enough, but something shifted. The children made her real to herself in ways being queen never had. When she held them, she wasn't the Austrian failure or the spendthrift disaster or the barren disappointment turned baby factory. She was just a mother, and they were just children who needed her. But they were also royal children, and Versailles ate childhood the way it ate everything else, systematically, ceremonially, with smiles. The parties continued, the gambling continued, the spending continued. The fantasy she'd built required constant maintenance, constant expansion, constant denial of the mathematics that said this couldn't last forever. France was going bankrupt. The American Revolution, which France had enthusiastically funded to spite Britain, had emptied the treasury. Harvest failures were making bread expensive. The tax system was broken, with the people who could afford to pay exempted by law, while those who couldn't pay bore the entire burden. Marie's jewellery budget alone could have fed a province, but she didn't know that. Didn't want to know that. Knowledge meant responsibility, and responsibility meant facing the prison she'd been decorating for years. So she danced faster, gambled harder, built her wigs higher, turned the music up louder, and pretended not to hear the sound of France beginning to crack beneath her feet. The cage was still a cage. She just kept redecorating it. Each new party another coat of guilt over the bars. But parties and gambling weren't enough. The cage, no matter how decorated, was still a cage. So her husband, perhaps out of affection, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps just to keep her quiet, gave Marie the one thing she truly wanted, a key. The key opened the Petit Trianon, a small palace on the grounds of Versailles, and in that space, Marie would build her masterpiece of denial, her perfect lie, her ultimate escape. The Petit Trianon had been built by the previous king for his mistress. Now it belonged to Marie, and the gift came with one crucial stipulation. No one, not even the king himself, could enter without her permission. It was sovereign territory, a kingdom within a kingdom, 6 acres where she was finally, completely, terrifyingly free. She made it into something that would become infamous, symbolic, the physical embodiment of everything France would grow to hate about her. But it was also something else, something the revolutionary tribunals would never acknowledge. It was the only place she could be a mother. Versailles devoured childhood. Royal children belonged to France, raised by protocol and observed by thousands of eyes, every meal watched, every lesson monitored, every moment of spontaneity crushed beneath the weight of etiquette that dictated exactly how a prince should sit, stand, eat, breathe, exist. The Petit Trianon was Marie's attempt to carve out something different. A fantasy, yes. Escapism, absolutely. But also, and this matters, the only scrap of normal childhood she could give her children. The gardens came first, not the formal, geometric perfection of Versailles' main grounds, but something softer. The English garden style, winding paths, artful disorder, trees allowed to grow in shapes nature intended rather than what royal gardeners demanded. Wildflowers mixed with roses, a grotto with a waterfall, streams that wandered rather than flowed in straight channels. Walking those paths, you could almost forget you were at Versailles, almost imagine you were somewhere else, someone else, free. Then came her masterpiece, her perfect lie, the thing history would never forgive, the Hameau de la Reine, the Queen's Hamlet, a fake peasant village built by the finest architects in France at astronomical expense. 12 buildings arranged around a small lake, a farmhouse, a dairy, a mill, a dovecote, a boudoir disguised as a cottage, each structure perfect in its rustic fantasy, thatched roofs that didn't leak, exposed timber that never rotted, a water wheel that turned nothing but looked picturesque doing it. The farmhouse had rough-hewn beams on the outside and silk-lined drawing rooms on the inside. The dairy, where Marie would sometimes go to make butter, featured porcelain churns and marble counters. Everything was clean, nothing smelled bad. It was poverty as imagined by someone who'd never been poor, rural life as designed by someone who'd never been rural. She kept animals, sheep, but washed and brushed until their wool gleamed, tied with ribbons in blue and pink, goats with bells that chimed melodically, chickens that were probably better fed than most French peasants. Someone, a servant, always a servant, had to perfume the sheep because even in her fantasy, Marie couldn't tolerate the smell of real farm animals, the sound of the hameau, birds singing in perfect, Disney-like harmony, water babbling in calculated streams, the soft lowing of cattle that never face slaughter, the laughter of her children running free, finally free, even if the freedom was as fake as everything else. She would dress in simple muslin gowns. Simple, in the sense that they cost more than a peasant would earn in 5 years, but without the court's formal embroidery and jewels. She would carry a porcelain bucket that had never held anything dirty. She would pretend to milk cows already milked by actual farmers, or gather eggs already gathered and artfully replaced. She was performing poverty as an escape from royalty, playing at being a milkmaid to avoid being queen, and she did it while real peasants, just a few miles away in villages she'd never visit, were boiling grass and bark to feed their children through another failed harvest. The Petit Trianon wasn't just for her, though. This is what gets lost in the mockery. Buried beneath the legitimate criticism, she built it for her children, at Versailles proper. Her daughter Marie-Thérèse was being groomed for diplomatic marriage from birth. Her son, the Dauphin Louis-Joseph, was already drowning in the weight of expectations, his childhood sacrificed to the endless lessons and formality required of the future king. The boy was sickly, frail, already showing signs of the tuberculosis that would kill him before his 8th birthday. At the hameau, they could run. They could play in the dirt, carefully cultivated dirt, but still, they could feed chickens and chase geese and pretend, for a few hours, that they were just children instead of chess pieces in dynastic games. Marie would watch them from the cottage doorway, these small creatures she'd made, and something in her chest would tighten and release. Here, in this expensive lie. They were hers, not France's, not the crown's, just hers. She threw parties at the Petit Trianon too, but different ones, smaller, more intimate. Her chosen family, the Polignacs and a few others, invited to dinners where she could serve the meal herself, playing at being the hostess of a country house rather than the Queen of France. They would stroll the gardens at sunset, the light golden on the fake cottages, and pretend they were somewhere else entirely. The cost of this fantasy kingdom was staggering. The construction alone ran to millions of livres. The maintenance, keeping those thatched roofs picture perfect, those gardens manicured to look wild, those animals clean and ribboned, required a small army of servants working invisibly to maintain the illusion. France was bankrupt, bread riots were becoming common, the treasury was empty, and Marie was spending fortunes to build a fake farm where she could pretend to be poor. It was the perfect metaphor. The Queen of France, pretending to be a peasant in a million-franc fantasy village, while real peasants starved close enough to hear the laughter from her parties. This was the crime, not cruelty, not malice, but a profound, fatal, total disconnect from reality. A disconnect she'd built, stone by expensive stone, to protect her own heart and give her children something she'd never had, a single scrap of freedom, even if that freedom was as fake as everything else in her gilded cage. She built a lie to escape a truth, and in doing so, gave France exactly the symbol it would need when the real world finally came crashing through her gates. The problem with living in a fantasy is that you're not there to defend yourself in the real world. And in 1785, the real world came for Marie Antoinette with a con so audacious, so perfectly designed to destroy her, that it might as well have been scripted by fate itself. The affair of the diamond necklace. It was a grift, a spectacular con worthy of the finest criminal minds, and Marie Antoinette, who had nothing to do with it, who never touched it, who didn't even want the thing, would be destroyed by it anyway, because the lie everyone believed was more powerful than any truth. The necklace itself was real enough, obscenely real. The jewelers Baymer and Bassange had spent years creating it. 647 diamonds, weighing nearly 2,800 carats, arranged in a glittering cascade designed to make its wearer look like she was drowning in captured starlight. It was the most expensive piece of jewellery in Europe. It cost 1.6 million livres, roughly $100 million in modern money. They'd made it for the previous king's mistress, Madame de Barry. But the king died before he could buy it, leaving the jewellers with an unsellable treasure. So they offered it to Marie Antoinette, repeatedly, for years, and she, perhaps showing the only fiscal restraint of her life, refused it. Even she could see it was too much, too expensive, too obvious a symbol of excess. Enter the criminals, 3 of them, each perfect for their role. First, Jeanne de Valois Saint-Remy, calling herself the Comtesse de la Motte, a con artist with noble blood diluted by poverty, burning with resentment, brilliant at reading people and finding their weaknesses. Second, Cardinal Louis de Rohan, a prince of the church, but also a vain, gullible fool who'd offended Marie years before and desperately wanted back in her good graces. Rich, connected, and stupid, the perfect mark. Third, Nicole Leguay d'Oliva, a prostitute who happened to look enough like Marie Antoinette to fool someone in darkness, at a distance, if they desperately wanted to be fooled. The con was elegant. Jeanne convinced Rohan that she was Marie's secret friend, that the Queen had forgiven him and wanted to communicate privately. She forged letters in Marie's handwriting, bad forgeries, but Rohan wanted to believe. She arranged a midnight meeting in the Versailles Gardens where Nicole, dressed in white muslin, whispered a few words to Rohan in the darkness before fleeing mysteriously. The cardinal was hooked. When Jeanne told him the Queen secretly wanted the necklace but couldn't be seen buying it publicly, that she needed Rohan to acquire it for her and would pay him back in installments, he believed her, wanted to believe her, needed it to be true. He went to the jewellers, signed for the necklace as the Queen's representative, handed it over to Jeanne's husband, who immediately took it to London and sold the diamonds individually for a fraction of their value. but still enough to make them rich. The jewelers expected payment. When none came, they approached Marie directly, finally, desperately, asking when she'd like the remaining installments delivered, and Marie Antoinette, standing in her receiving room, had no idea what they were talking about. The scandal exploded like a powder magazine touched by flame. The cardinal was arrested. Jeanne was arrested. The whole sordid story came out in a trial that gripped France like the best theatre. The prostitute pretending to be the queen, the forged letters, the midnight garden meeting, the stolen necklace, the cardinal's ridiculous gullibility. And through it all, one fact emerged clearly. Marie Antoinette was completely, totally, 100% innocent. She'd had nothing to do with it. Never met Jeanne, never wrote the letters, never wanted the necklace, never received a single diamond. It didn't matter. France believed she was guilty. Of course she was. The queen of deficit, the Austrian prostitute, the woman who built fake farms. She would absolutely try to secretly buy the world's most expensive necklace, and then deny it when caught. The fact that the con made no sense. Why would she need a cardinal to buy jewellery she could order openly? Didn't matter. The story was too good, too perfect, too symbolic of everything they'd been taught to hate about her. The trial technically cleared her. Rohan was acquitted. The judges perhaps afraid to condemn a cardinal on behalf of an unpopular queen. Jeanne was convicted, branded, and imprisoned, though she'd escape later and spend years in London publishing salacious memoirs about her time as Marie's friend, each one more pornographic and false than the last. Marie had been proven innocent of the crime, but she'd been convicted of something more damaging. The narrative, the fantasy she'd built, the years of parties and gambling and the Hameau's expensive denial had become the evidence used against her. The people looked at the charges and thought, yes, that sounds exactly like something she would do. The myth she'd created, the shallow, frivolous image she'd cultivated to escape her reality, had solidified into fact in the public mind. The pamphlets exploded in creativity and cruelty, cartoons showing her in increasingly explicit situations, stories about her supposed sexual adventures with the cardinal, with the Polignacs, with stable boys, with anyone and everyone. The Austrian whore became France's favourite villain, guilty of everything anyone could imagine. This is when the "let them eat cake" line really took root, though she'd never said it. It was a quote from Rousseau's Confessions, written when Marie was still a child in Austria, attributed to a great princess decades earlier. But it didn't matter. France needed her to have said it, needed to believe she'd responded to bread shortages with aristocratic callousness. The real world had finally broken into the gilded cage. All the parties couldn't drown it out anymore. All the gambling couldn't distract from it. The Hameau's fantasy walls couldn't keep it away. Marie Antoinette had been found innocent of stealing a necklace, but she'd been found guilty of something much worse in the court of public opinion, being exactly who she'd spent 15 years proving herself to be. Frivolous, disconnected, shallow, living in a fantasy while France suffered in reality. The cage door was still locked, but now she could hear, clearly, the sound of the real France pressing against it from outside, and that sound was growing louder every day. Hungry and angry and done with her lies. She'd been cleared of the crime but convicted of the character. The trial ended, but her real punishment, the one France had been preparing for years, was only beginning. The fantasy ended on October 5th, 1789, with the sound of thousands of feet marching through rain toward Versailles. The real world, after years of knocking politely and then pounding desperately, finally kicked down the door. The revolution had begun months earlier with the storming of the Bastille in July. That moment historians love, when the people rose up and everything changed. But the Bastille was just Paris being Paris, theatrical and symbolic. The Women's March on Versailles was different. This was peasant women with kitchen knives and pikes, walking 12 miles through cold October rain because their children were hungry and they'd heard the Queen had bread. The sound reached Versailles before the crowd did. Not the organised tramp of an army, but something more terrifying. The rhythmic shuffle stomp of thousands of ordinary people who'd finally had enough. Voices carrying through the rain, sometimes singing, sometimes shouting, sometimes just the murmur of collective rage. Marie heard it from inside the palace, the sound of her world ending, marching toward her through the mud. She'd been trying, these last few months, really trying, after the necklace affair, after watching her husband forced to call the Estates General for the first time in 175 years, after seeing the political structures that kept her safe begin to crack. She'd attempted to engage with reality. Too little, too late, much too late. The crowd reached Versailles as night fell. Thousands of women, their faces streaked with rain and rage, their clothes soaked through, their voices hoarse from 12 miles of revolutionary songs. They'd brought weapons, not army weapons, but the tools of their lives, kitchen knives, market poles, pikes improvised from farming tools. One woman reportedly carried a cannon she'd taken from the Paris armory. They weren't there to negotiate. They were there to take what had been denied them. Bread. Answers. The king and queen themselves, the palace guards, faced with thousands of armed, furious women, essentially shrugged and let them in. What were they supposed to do? Fire on mothers? Cut down grandmothers? These weren't soldiers. These were just people, hungry, desperate people who'd walked 12 miles in cold rain because they had nothing left to lose. The crowd flooded into Versailles like water into a sinking ship. They killed 2 guards, tore them apart in the courtyard, their screams cutting through the sound of the rain. They took the heads and mounted them on pikes, carrying them like trophies, like warnings, like the first installment of payment on a debt France intended to collect in full. Marie fled through the secret passages of Versailles, those same corridors she'd used for late-night parties, now serving a different purpose. The sound behind her, boots on marble, voices echoing and the crash of furniture being overturned as the crowd searched room by room. She made it to the king's chambers. They barricaded themselves inside. Marie, Louis, the children clutching at their parents' clothes, terrified but trying to be quiet because even royal children understand when silence means survival. Outside their door, the sound of France demanding an audience. Lafayette, the commander of the Paris National Guard, had raced from Paris to try to maintain order. He negotiated through the night, the crowd on one side of the door, the royal family on the other, and Lafayette in between trying to prevent a massacre. By morning, the terms were clear. The king and queen would return to Paris, not as monarchs making a gracious visit to their capital, but as prisoners being escorted by their jailers. The carriage ride that had brought Marie to Versailles as a 14-year-old bride would be reversed. The same route, same distance, utterly different circumstances. They climbed into the carriage as dawn broke. The crowd surrounded them. Women who'd marched through rain, now marching back through mud, but this time with their prizes. The King and Queen of France being brought to Paris like captured animals being brought to market. The pikes with the guards' heads led the procession. Someone had stuck bread on the ends of other pikes, waving it triumphantly. See, there was bread at Versailles after all, just not for them. The crowd sang, shouted, some danced in the mud. They'd done it. They'd gone to the palace and brought back the king. More importantly, they'd brought back the Austrian whore, the fake peasant in her fake village, the woman with the tall hair and empty head who'd allegedly told them to eat cake. Marie sat in the carriage, her children pressed against her, watching France celebrate her capture. This was the first time she'd really seen it. Not Versailles, not her fantasy, but the actual country she'd supposedly ruled. They looked nothing like her perfumed sheep. They were thin, angular, hard in ways she'd never imagined people could be hard. They reached Paris and were installed in the Tuileries Palace, prisoners in all but name, guarded by National Guards who made no pretense of deference. The cage had changed location, but it was still a cage. And here, something shifted in Marie Antoinette. The frivolous girl who'd spent 15 years escaping reality finally, devastatingly, woke up. She started paying attention to politics, to the revolution, to the impossible situation her family was in. She wrote letters, coded desperate, to her brother in Austria, to other European monarchs, begging for intervention. She counselled the king, pushed him toward decisions, tried to navigate the impossible maze of revolutionary politics. Too little, too late, but she tried. The months blurred into years. 1790. Failed escape attempts. The infamous flight to Varennes, where they almost made it to the border before being recognised and dragged back. Each failure tightening the noose, making their position more precarious. The king's power was stripped away piece by piece. Constitutional monarchy, then suspended monarchy, then no monarchy at all. In August 1792, they were moved from the Tuileries to the Temple, an actual prison. No pretense anymore. Marie Antoinette, who'd spent her life trying not to be queen, was finally forced to become one just in time to lose her crown. The shallow girl playing dress-up was gone. In her place, a mother trying desperately to protect her children in a world that had decided they were better off dead. The fantasy had collapsed. The cage had become a cell, and the woman France needed to be a monster was finally becoming the queen she'd always pretended to be. Strong, defiant, and utterly, hopelessly doomed. We return to where we began, the cell in the Conciergerie, October 1793. The candle guttering, the woman in black with white hair, sewing her morning dress, prisoner 280, the widow Capet, they called her now. The revolution had stripped away even her name, no longer Marie Antoinette, Queen of France, just the widow of citizen Louis Capet, the man who'd been her husband until they separated his head from his body in January. She'd been there, forced to listen from her cell in the temple as the drums rolled and the crowd roared. She hadn't seen it, couldn't see from her window, but she'd heard it. The sound of her husband's execution, the sound of her children's father being killed. Afterward, they'd taken her son, Louis Charles, 8 years old, heir to nothing now. They took him away from her and gave him to a cobbler named Simon with instructions to make him forget he'd ever been a prince, to re-educate him, break him, turn him against his mother. She never saw him again. Her daughter Marie-Thérèse remained close, in another cell in the temple, close enough that Marie could sometimes hear her moving around. This 15-year-old girl living in stone rooms that smelled of mould and despair. But they couldn't speak, couldn't see each other, just parallel prisoners in parallel cells. Then in August, they moved Marie here, to the Conciergerie, death row. Everyone knew what it meant. The show trial came in October, 2 days of testimony. Accusations. A verdict already written before the first witness spoke. They accused her of everything, of stealing from the treasury, of sending French military secrets to Austria, of conspiring with foreign powers against France. The frivolous girl was gone. In her place sat a silent, composed, dignified woman who barely responded to the charges. What was there to say? She was guilty of the narrative. The trial was just paperwork. And then they played their final, monstrous card. They brought in her son, little Louis Charles, the boy she hadn't seen in months, pale and thin and broken. They'd coached him, tortured him, forced him to sign a confession so vile it barely deserves repeating. They accused her of incest. The courtroom went silent. Even the Revolutionary Tribunal, hardened by months of trials and executions, seemed to collectively hold its breath. The charge was absurd, impossible, the last desperate attempt to make her into a monster beyond redemption. And this was the moment the Queen broke, not for herself, for her children, for what they'd done to her son to extract that false confession, for the absolute monstrosity of men who would destroy a child to destroy his mother. She'd been silent through most of the trial, letting the accusations wash over her like rain she no longer felt. But this she couldn't let stand. She stood, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the slow, inevitable rising of someone who has finally found the line they will not cross. And she did something extraordinary. She turned away from the all-male tribunal, away from the prosecutors and the judges and the men who held her life in their hands. She turned to the women in the crowd, the mothers, the same women who'd marched to Versailles 4 years earlier. "I appeal," she said, her voice steady in the stone room, "to all mothers present, is such a crime possible?" For just a moment, the revolutionary theatre paused. Some of the women in the crowd wept, others looked away, because they were mothers, and they knew. They knew what it cost to hear your child broken. They knew what it meant to have your love weaponized against you. It didn't matter. It wasn't going to matter. The verdict was already written. But for that one moment, the frivolous girl who'd lived in a fantasy was gone. Only the mother remained. Only the woman. The guilty verdict came the next morning. Execution scheduled for noon. They cropped her hair, roughly, carelessly. The same hands that had once spent hours dressing her wigs now just hacking away. They bound her hands, they loaded her into a cart, not even a closed carriage this time. Just an open cart like they use for common criminals. The route to the guillotine took an hour of Paris jeering, celebrating, throwing things. An hour of her sitting upright in the cart, refusing to bow her head, watching the city that had once been hers celebrate her death. When she climbed the scaffold, her last act was to step on the executioner's foot, an accident in her bound hands and confused state. Her last recorded words, "Pardon me, monsieur, I did not do it on purpose." Even at the end, apologising. The habit of politeness beaten into a 14-year-old girl at Versailles, still functioning at the moment of her death. The blade fell at 12:15 p.m, October 16th, 1793. The crowd roared. Justice, they called it. Payment for the years of excess, the fantasy farms, the gambling, the disconnect. Let them eat cake. Did she say it? No, of course not. It was a misattributed quote from Rousseau, written when she was still a child in Austria. But France needed her to have said it. Needed her to be the monster. Needed her to embody everything wrong with the old regime. The story was true even if the quote was false. She had lived in a fantasy while France starved. She had built a fake farm while real farmers failed. She had played at poverty while surrounded by unfathomable wealth. She was guilty of profound disconnection, of terminal frivolity, of being a child playing dress-up when the times demanded a queen. The price of greatness? Perhaps. Or perhaps the price of frivolity. The price of being shallow in deep times. The price of building walls of fantasy so thick that when reality finally broke through, there was no time left to adapt. You don't get to write your own story, Marie Antoinette learned. You become the person the world needs you to be. And in 1789, France didn't need a queen, it needed a monster, a scapegoat, a symbol of everything wrong with the old order. So they took the lonely, shallow, frivolous girl and made her the villain. And in the end, in that dark cell, as reality closed in and fantasy became impossible, she finally became what she'd always been supposed to be. Strong, defiant, dignified, just in time to die. The cage was always a prison. It was just gilded for a while, and when they stripped away the gilt, The parties, the wigs, the hamo, the fantasy. What remained was simpler than myth allows. A woman who'd been a frightened child sold into circumstances she couldn't handle, who'd escaped into denial when she should have engaged with reality, and who'd paid for that disconnect with her life. History would remember the guillotine, the scandal, the let-them-eat-cake lie, the frivolous queen who deserved her fate, but in that cell, in those final days, there was just a woman who'd once been a girl named Antonia, who'd been stripped of everything at a border crossing and told to become someone else, and who'd spent her whole life trying to remember who she'd been before the cage. So settle in now, let the echoes of that crowd fade, let the sound of the blade fall silent, let the story of the gilded cage drift away like smoke from a candle, finally allowed to gutter out. She was not the monster they needed her to be, but she wasn't the innocent she needed to be either. She was just human, shallow where she should have been deep, frivolous where she should have been serious, a child playing at being adult in times that demanded maturity she'd never been taught. The real tragedy isn't that she was evil, it's that she was ordinary, and ordinary wasn't enough, not for France, not for the revolution, not for history. Sleep now, the gilded cage is empty, the candle is out, the story is over, and somewhere, in the autumn dark of 1793, a woman's white hair catches the last light before the blade falls, and for just a moment she remembers being 14, crossing a border, becoming someone else. The cage was always a prison. It was just gilded for a time.